Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about psychic detectives and their role in helping solve crimes and find missing persons. My guest today is Pam Coronado. Ms. Coronado is a psychic detective, and she has been featured on a number of television programs, including Discovery Channel's Sensing Murder series. Welcome, Pam, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Well, thanks for having me.
Regular viewers of our program are going to realize that we did a show earlier about remote viewing, and remote viewing is certainly one of the tools in your toolkit as a psychic detective. But we're going to go much more broadly and much more comprehensively today in describing your work as a psychic detective. Okay. I will also start by saying that you didn't really choose this line of work so much as this line of work chose you because of the skills and abilities that you started to exhibit a number of years ago. And so before we start to talk about some specific situations and cases you've been involved in and how you approach the work of a psychic detective, we need to talk about some skills and abilities and definitions of what those skills are. Now, I can think of three terms right off the top. One is clairvoyance. Another one is clairaudience, and a third one is clairsentience. Yep. What do those three terms mean?
Clairvoyance actually translates as clear seeing. So that's visual images, so intuitive visual images. And of course that's mental images coming in mentally, that you're not actually seeing them with your eyes. Clairaudience is clear hearing. Same thing, you're hearing these with your brain, hearing them intuitively, sounds, words, thoughts, telepathic type ideas. All of that falls under clairaudience. And then clairsentience is clear feeling. So that's more empathic and picking up on other people's feelings and intentions and that kind of thing.
Okay, and then there's another term called claircognizance that we need to talk about. What is claircognizance?
Clear knowing. So that's when you just happen to know something. You don't know why you know it, and you don't know how to explain. You just know it. That's the definition. There's
also a term called intuitive. And we also use that term when we talk about intuition and having an intuitive sense. And most common people would say, well, I had a gut feeling or a gut instinct about something. I had a little bit of knowledge, but a lot of emotion attached to that knowledge about whatever that was. It could be about a person, it could be about a business deal, it could be about a house that they're about to buy. It could be any number of things, maybe a career change. I had a gut feeling or an intuitive sense that this wasn't the right one for me, and so I canceled the deal. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about intuition? Is that related to what we're talking about? And
I think everybody's inherently has that. So we're all naturally intuitive. It's just a matter of who's listening.
Okay, and let's also talk about the term medium and mediumship. What does a medium do, and how does that also fit into this whole range of skills and abilities?
So, as they say, all psychics are not mediums, but all mediums are psychic. So mediumship is actually speaking to the spirit of someone who's crossed over. So that's the definite mediumship.
Okay, let's go back to remote viewing. Since I think I mentioned that earlier, let's talk about how that skill is also in your toolkit and how it is maybe more narrow than some of the other abilities that we've been talking about.
So remote viewing is a process. You still use the same skills. You still use clairvoyance and clairaudience and those kinds of things, but it's a very specific, controlled process. So it's a step-by-step process, and it's usually after a very specific goal. So it really works well for missing persons because I can be blind to what it is I'm working on. Somebody can ask me to describe a location, and I don't know what it is I'm working on, but that's really great in a high-profile case or some case that's been all over the news or something like that, where all of this noise would be making it very difficult to get a clear read. So it's actually a really great tool for that kind of work.
If we were to assess all of these skills and abilities, and as we talked about before the show, these are all arrows in your quiver. Which arrow is the strongest, most accurate arrow, or are all of these abilities evenly distributed?
I started out as a very strong clairvoyant. Everything was visual, and as I started learning remote viewing, I started expanding quite a bit. So now it's pretty, I use all of them. I have to say I do equally try to use all of them.
Let's talk about your process when you are involved in a criminal case and you're trying to help solve the crime and you've been called in by the detectives. What happens when you're brought in and what is the process you go through?
So I generally don't let them tell me much about what I'm working on, other than, you know, we have a victim or we have a missing person or whatever it is that they're wanting to know. And then I set about systematically answering all the who, what, why, when, where. So I approach it as a reporter would, trying to get information about each of those questions.
And when you start to receive messages, because we are talking about receiving information that you process as a psychic, where does that information come from and how are you able to process it?
You know, there's two answers to that. there's the spiritual answer and there's the scientific answer. So the spiritual answer is maybe there's spirit guides out there helping give information. The scientific answer is that, and this is what I truly believe, is that there's sort of this universal knowledge, and everything is out there, is available to us, and it's being able to tap into that universal wisdom sort of stream of consciousness.
Okay, and so when you are receiving information, you have mentioned in some materials that I've read that you actually go through maybe 3 steps or 3 phases. What are those 3 phases?
You mean for all intuition?
Yeah, well, when you, I think what you referenced in the materials I'm talking about, you said there's a subconscious phase where information comes to you subconsciously, and then it becomes more of a nagging sensation. That's step 2, and then step 3 is a real sense of urgency.
I think for all of us go through those 3, have sort of those 3 basic levels of how intuition functions for us. And one is, I think we're guided around a lot by our subconscious a lot more than we're aware of, and we sort of turn left without thinking about it, but then we end up right where we're supposed to be, right when we're supposed to be there. So we're not consciously doing that, we're just sort of more in tune than we realize we are. And then there's the nagging feeling where a thought crosses your mind. You may think that it's coming from you, that you're just thinking it. But for me, if a thought crosses my mind more than twice, then I assume that that's my intuition trying to tell me, you need to pay attention here.
And how much of this information that you're receiving has to be interpreted by you so that you're putting some value or some meaning to the information? And is that potentially problematic? Because if you're putting a value or some meaning to this information, could you be going astray because you're adding too much of your own input?
Correct. I try not to do that. So I learned very long ago by making a lot of mistakes on national TV to describe exactly what I see, exactly what I hear, and exactly what I feel, and not elaborate. I try really hard not to elaborate. When you're working with police, you know, I don't know what the file says. So for me to judge what's coming in and edit it and decide something silly or doesn't make any sense, I try not to do that because I don't know what makes sense or what doesn't, and it's not my job to analyze what it is. It's the detective's job to analyze it.
And so if we're talking about a murder case, will you actually be able to visualize the face of the murderer?
Sometimes, yeah.
That does happen.
It doesn't always happen that I easily just magically see a face in front of me. Sometimes I have to actually build it element by element. So I'll actually start sketching a face before I know what it looks like, and I'll start asking what the eyes look like, what the nose looks like, what the mouth looks like. Sometimes I will sort of flash on it and see the whole face, but a lot of times I'm actually creating it element by element. I'm really good at hair. I always see hair first.
Okay, and so after you've done this and you've translated this information to paper so that the police can look at it, do they then bring out the mugshot book and have you go through the mugshots? How successful is that usually when you go through mugshots?
It can actually be more confusing. Sometimes I will recognize the person right off, and sometimes it actually makes it a little bit more confusing. And in that case, I tend to go through each mugshot and feel what I feel about that person. If I feel they're capable of violence, or they're just a normal person, or what's going on. I'll actually have stacks. So I'll have 2 stacks. I'll have the non-violent people and the violent people, and then I try to feel which one's actually involved in my scenario.
And then the detectives have the responsibility of then finding the evidence. If you've identified someone, they then have to go on the evidence trail.
That's right.
And find out what's going on. Okay, you actually pursued a private investigator's license in the state of Arizona and put in about, I think it was 6,000 hours of investigative work to qualify for that license. Why was it important for you to pursue an actual license in private investigation?
I think there was a couple of things. One, just to add some legitimacy to the work that I was doing, but it was also really great. I wanted to go through the training as well because it taught me what works in an investigation and what doesn't, what's important, what's not. And that really helped my work going forward as far as knowing what detectives need, what's helpful, what's not, that kind of thing.
Okay, we only have about a minute before the break because time really flies when we're having these conversations, but I wanted to ask you about the emotional toll of doing psychic detective work, because if we're talking about murder cases or even in the case of missing persons, there can be some pretty strong emotional content involved in all of this. How does that affect you as a psychic, and can you actually get burned out on too much emotion?
You definitely can. You have to learn to step back and see things like a fly on the wall and not get overly emotionally involved in what's going on. I like to think of myself as a witness and not getting overly involved in it.
Okay, and on that note, we will go to the break. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk about missing persons and how Pam is involved in finding missing persons. Stay tuned.
Make a difference in someone's life. With the ever-increasing amount of senior citizens in the United States, the need for counselors, caregivers, advocates, and product developers continues to rise. Be there for someone and see how rewarding it can be. You can become part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Pam Coronado. Pam is a psychic detective, and we're talking about the work that psychic detectives do in solving crimes and finding missing persons. I mentioned before we went to the break, we're going to talk about missing persons, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to follow up on more questions about solving murder cases and so forth. What happens when you and a detective that you're working with, a police detective, have different opinions about where this case should go? I know that's happened.
Happens a lot.
It happens a lot. And what usually occurs when that happens, and how does it get resolved in the end?
Well, I've worked with the FBI a lot, and one of the things that they explain to me is that if they focus in on only what I'm telling them, and they get tunnel vision and they sort of ignore everything else, they're not doing their job. And so I don't take personal offense to them pursuing other avenues. I've learned to not get personal about it. And so
they have a responsibility to follow all of the reasonable leads.
Exactly, because they're not doing their job if they just zero in on the one thing that I'm saying to them.
Right.
I do hope that they are listening, though, and they are paying attention to what I'm saying to them. And a lot of times I'm content to let them chase these leads around and know that they're probably not going to go anywhere. And then they'll come back and say, what were you saying about that guy again? So usually they circle back around after they've chased down all those leads.
So you have to let them go through the paces and then come back.
And
they're
a lot
ready.
of times they are on the same page, but sometimes, you know, they may have a very, very favorite scenario, and I'm giving them something totally different. And so just human nature, it takes a while for people to sort of change direction sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And I know that there is a very famous high-profile case, we're not going to mention the case, but you were involved in one that you had a very strong opinion about what needed to happen in that case. They ended up prosecuting and convicting someone that you believe is not the right suspect. Tell us not about specifically that case, but what was your reaction to all of this?
That's one of the times I actually considered walking away from this field, probably. I was very upset. I had tried everything I could think of to convince them not to go after this person, that he was not involved. And he has been exonerated, of course, and released from prison. But that was a very challenging situation.
And so being a psychic detective can be emotionally challenging just in the work itself, but it can also be challenging if things go the wrong way with the prosecution based on what you're receiving.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and as far as missing persons, let's talk about that now. You have a particular passion for finding missing persons, and you seem to have determined that that's your greatest calling in life, is to help people find missing persons. Why is that?
I think because law enforcement has to give up on it, and so there's nobody helping some of these people. And I don't fault law enforcement, it's just the system, and they can only put so many resources into it. So, so I just feel that there's this great need out there, and I really, really enjoy the puzzle, to be honest. I really like describing locations and figuring out where it is and trying to figure out what it is that I'm seeing and find that on the map. It's all very challenging and interesting.
I know you're involved in a current case at the moment involving a man by the name of David O'Sullivan, who is a hiker that was missing in the San Jacinto Mountains here in Southern California. Tell us about that case.
Yep, he's an Irish national, and he came over to hike the PCT, Pacific Crest Trail, and was last seen in Idlewild, California, and then just vanished from there. And so I've taken, I think, 4 trips up to the mountain, and I've been on every single trail. And it's physically challenging. But you know, people think that the whole mountain must look the same. So how in the world would you ever try to find a missing person up there on that mountain? But I do have landmarks. I have a very strong visual of a particular panoramic view, and I know how wide the trail is, I know what color the soil is, I know there's leaves instead of pine needles, which tells us sort of an elevation, whether there's snow, I know that there's no snow, those kinds of things. All of those things are really important, and we just keep at it until I find all of those elements come together.
How long has he been missing?
18 months.
Okay. And you also have worked with cadaver dogs as well in searches. And do dogs, I know that they have a much stronger sense of scent, but in your experience, do you believe that dogs also have an intuitive sense as well?
I do, and one of, you know, the way for me it works with the dogs, and I wish it could work this way with David's case, but it cannot. But typically I try to get them into the general area and then let the dogs do their thing and let the dogs find what they're looking for. But I definitely have had dogs intuitively tune into what it was that I was interested in and run over there, even though I was trying so hard to be neutral and not persuade them anyway, they would still go right to the spot that I was thinking.
And you mentioned an example, an anecdote of when that happened once, and the dog handler was getting frustrated because he could sort of intuitively sense that you were influencing the dog.
She kept saying, "Stop influencing my dog." Yeah.
Okay, and so your opinion, animals do have a sixth sense, if we want to call it that?
I believe so.
So this ability to use psychic phenomenon is not confined to humans.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I know that there are various people that are into horse whispering and things of that nature, and so they would sort of also answer yes to that question, that there's something going on there. That's,
definitely.
Right.
They're so much smarter than we give them credit for, but they're also so much more intuitive than we give them credit for.
Okay. When we talk about missing persons and you have to meet a family for the first time, what happens in that initial meeting, and what sort of ground rules do you lay down for the family?
Good question. Usually I just get some photographs of the person. Sometimes I get personal objects or something to hold to work with, which is another skill set we didn't talk much about, but psychometry is where you hold an object and get information about it. So sometimes that will help me really connect to a person who's missing. But, sorry, I forgot where we were going with that.
No, what is the meeting like, the first meeting you have?
Well, one of the ground rules that I do, put with them is I don't want them on searches with me. I just don't feel that's appropriate. It's just too difficult for everyone. And I generally will try to get them to let me work directly with the detective instead of feeding all the information to them, just because there's a lot of ethical concerns. It's a very murky gray area.
Have you been successful in finding missing persons, and then when there was a reunion with the family, was it not what the family had hoped for?
Twice I've found people who were alive and did not want to be found. So
what happened in those cases?
The one in particular, the family did go and meet with him, and he just said he didn't want to go back to his old life, and they gave him some money and
they parted ways. Okay. So kind of sad, even in the resolution. But unfortunately, 98%, 99% of the time, the person is gone. They're dead.
Yeah, that's probably about the right percentage.
Okay. All right, well, let's talk about cold cases, because television crime dramas are always focusing on CSI and forensic evidence and solving cold cases and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of fascination with that. You work on cold cases. Are cold cases more challenging? And when I say more challenging, are they more challenging just because they happened a long time ago, or are they more challenging because the information is not as available to you, or is it just as easy to have or to receive information about cold cases as it is cases that happen right now?
I have not found them to be more difficult as far as the time goes. So to me, looking at a case that's 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old doesn't really make that much of a difference. So going back in time, the only hiccup I have definitely had is in a cold case. I did describe, the case was 26 years old, and then I did describe a suspect who was in his 60s, and then there was some confusion on my part because I didn't know if he was 60 then or if he was 60 now. So I've now trained myself not to get in that position, and when I'm asking myself questions, I will say, show me what they look like at the time of the murder, or show me what they look like now. So I know what I'm seeing, then I can translate it better.
Okay, and so when you're dealing with a cold case, the information is as available as it was then when it happened, and that's consistent with what we discussed on the remote viewing program, that you can remote view in the past, the present, and the future. And so it's all tight. That information exists, There's no dating, there's no
Right.
expiration date on that information that exists out there. So you can access it. It's just a matter of being able to determine when it happened that you're looking at that individual, I guess.
You know, it has come up as a couple of issues in the past in missing persons cases, because I had a case where I started describing a red barn. I was describing an area perfectly, but I kept describing a red barn. And they kept saying, but there's no red barn there. It's so weird. You're describing this place, but there's no red barn. And then finally someone came who had lived there for many years, said, oh, there used to be a red barn here. So I was picking up on the past.
We only have about a minute left. Pam, how do you prepare for cases when you know it's going to be a challenge? Do you do meditation to clear your mind? And is clearing your mind an important function in being able to do psychic detective work?
Meditation is a must to do this work. People think that they can get around it and be intuitive, and you have to learn how to control the mind chatter so that the information can come in clearly. So if all of your thoughts and random ideas and stuff are clogging up the pipes, you have to be able to get out of the way.
What about when people come up to you and say, Pam, I want to be a psychic detective? How do you know if they're for real or not?
I tell them to take my class and we find out.
What are the indicators to you that someone's ready for this?
Usually, I believe everybody's intuitive, so I don't think that's usually the issue. It's more of the personality. Are they able to step back and be objective, and are they able emotionally to handle that kind of content?
So they have to separate the emotional content and also be able to clear their minds so that the chatter doesn't cause them to interpret more than they should.
Right, right. That's a big issue, yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you for sharing your information with us on today's program.
It's been fun. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.